welcome you up. If I can get my, yes, good, I've got it working this time. So please welcome Paul Massingham. I will Occupation Health and Safety tell you, please don't trip over the cords. Paul is a recent addition 12 months ago to the City of Ipswich team and has taken on one of the critical roles of the Office of Economic Development. So I've asked him to come along. He will take questions, but I think we'll let him go through his presentation and we can ask questions throughout. So Paul, thank you so much for coming again, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Di, and thanks very much for the opportunity to be here. Greg Chamello, our interim administrator, was actually the first invitation to this spot today, but unfortunately was unable to make it, so I've been given the task. So Greg has given me a range of talking points, and I'll do my best not to read and talk more freely, and more than happy to have this more as a discussion, especially if any thoughts or questions that you want to have. I think we've got about 20 minutes.
Yeah.
And feel free to wind up, with 5 to go.
No problem.
So, for me, it's a very interesting segue that we talk about the challenges that AMP have been through and the process they're going through in the leadership change over the past 12 months. Ipswich City Council, I would argue, has not been in a different position. Mind if I move around a little bit? I think better when I move.
Please do, and your voice so that it goes to the back room.
I took on the role of the manager of the Office of Economic Development 12 months ago, and while being headhunted for the role, I was very aware of some of the challenges that Ipswich were going through, and sat down with my wife and had the conversation about what does that mean, moving to Ipswich, even quite frankly from a career perspective, and specifically chose to come here because in all of the evidence and research that I had done, Ipswich is probably, from an economic development perspective, which is my first interest, probably one of the most best positioned local government authorities in Queensland. Organisationally, we have some challenges to work through, and I'll talk through some of those processes that we've been through over the past 9 months, and we'll continue to do until March 20th of March next year, which is the next local government elections across Queensland, when we will see the return of councillors to Ipswich. Some of the major things that Greg, if he was here today, would have talked about is the introduction of 18 transformational projects, as we're referring to them internally. I know that sounds very bureaucratic. The bulk of those projects are around governance, process, procedures, and transparency of the way the council does business. Again, I appreciate that probably sounds quite bureaucratic, but from a ratepayer's perspective, it is absolutely in the best interest of the community moving forward. It is about talking about ethical investments. It is about ethical procedures, making decisions that are based on evidence and in the best interest of a community. Some of you may have participated recently in a divisional boundary review. So this was a process that our interim administrator led. We had 1,049 respondents to that. 3 options were put forward. Those options were the previous model, where there was 1 councillor per division across the region. Another option was no divisions whatsoever, and councillors representing 1 geographic location. And the third option was a smaller number of divisions, 4 to 6 possible divisions, with multiple councillors within each division. Roughly the same number of councillors as had previously existed, but under a different geographic dispersal. So out of that process, which was both an online and a public community consultation process, the smaller number of divisions, of which is proposed 4 to 6 with multiple councillors per division, has been the one that most people responded to. The next step now is the interim administrator has forwarded that up to the Minister, Sterling Hinchcliffe, Minister for Local Government, for consideration. It is a decision that only the state government can make, and further reviews will now be done by the Minister and the Commission, and we expect that the Minister will then make a decision on that prior to the 20th of March next year, the next local government elections. Community reference groups is a new initiative that the interim administrator has developed. There are 5 community reference groups: economic development, resilient communities, growth management, environment, and transparent governance. 151 eligible nominations were received, and 99 locals have been selected to sit on those 5 community reference groups. The first meeting of those will be conducted at the end of June. The purpose of those community reference groups is, for those that may not be familiar with council process, once a month committee papers are sent up to committee based on those 5 different committees. From those committees, the recommendations will go to council for resolution. Prior to committee papers going up to those committees, they will be consulted on by members of the community who represent the 5 different committees, whether that be around a new investment opportunity, a community development program. So the purpose of it from Greg's perspective was, let's hear from a series of advisors, community-based, on specific subject matters before they are put forward to recommendations for council consideration. So that will be enacted by the end of June, and they will meet on a monthly basis moving forward. One of the other things under the transformational projects is a review of the role of the councillor. And I will actually read this because this was a specific statement that Greg brought out. So the interim administrator is focused on getting out and about in the community, speaking at events and meeting with passionate locals to start the process of re-educating the community about the role of a councillor, as the city's perception of what a councillor should or shouldn't be doesn't necessarily reflect what the legislation and the Act requires of a councillor. One of the processes and one of the transformational projects is specifically to identify and put regulatory environments in place for councils upon their return. It will be very specific and very prescriptive as to what a councillor can and can't do in a decision-making process. Everything from conflicts of interest to their roles in council and how the code of conduct needs to be implemented within council. The councillor's role from a public perspective is to engage, to talk to the community, to hear from the community. But there are legislative requirements on then how a councillor acts and conducts decision-making processes within the process of local government. That is something that is going to be documented and handed to each councillor as an induction to council upon the election of the 20th of March next year. Probably one of the largest projects being conducted at the moment is the planning scheme. So over the next 5 weeks, I think it was actually launched 2 days ago, there was some media around a consultation process. It's expected that it will take about 2 years to complete, and this is what they refer to when we talk about the planning scheme. It's basically a land use planning scheme. So every square inch of land across Ipswich, whether it be residential, commercial, industrial, is being reviewed and put forward for consultation at the moment. The way we're looking at developing the planning scheme moving forward, whereas we look at Ipswich as an entire local government area, the planning scheme will actually be released in 30 sub-plans. So that will actually include a particular, whether it be residential, commercial or industrial. So you'll be able to go in, have a look at your own site, or for example, where an investment property might be, and understand what it's been zoned as and what that means over the next 10 to 20 years. It also sets the scene for things like green space, open spaces, high toxicity type activities, especially in waste management, which I'll get to in a minute. But it talks about how do we balance lifestyle, community requirements, but also drive and set the community up as an attractive place to invest, and really make it very clear to investors what kind of activity can happen in different locations. So certainly encourage everyone to go and have a look at that, especially I think if you, not only from a residential investment perspective, but commercial and industrial landholders, it's always important to understand what your investment looks like moving forward. So waste management, 5 councils in southeast Queensland, which is Logan, Ipswich, Redland, Lockyer Valley and Somerset, have combined efforts to release an expression of interest. This will be a global expression of interest within what they refer to as biofutures and resource recovery space. As everyone probably knows, Ipswich has got quite a history in waste management, not necessarily a great history, potentially, and what we're looking for is what does technology look like on how we can manage that particular space moving forward. The state has made this a significant priority, released $100 million to both private sector and local governments to investigate these opportunities. From my role's perspective, I think the waste space, or bio-future space, is probably one of our largest economic opportunities. The job creation that comes from this particular environment, if you look globally, is enormous. To give you facts and figures, at the moment, approximately for every 100 tonnes of waste created, there is a job created from every 100 tonne of what they call feedstock. Ironically, where you look in many other industry sectors, the introduction of technology reduces the number of jobs within a space. In the waste management space, it's the exact opposite. So the introduction of new technologies per 100 tonnes of waste actually produces 4.5 jobs. So that it is something that we really need to look at. One of Ipswich's biggest advantages is what they refer to as feedstock. We have such a high volume of waste, and waste comes from everything from household waste to commercial waste to recycling products into Ipswich, that we are actually very attractive from an investment perspective. What we need to be careful of is to ensure that the investment of new technologies meets our community standards. It also talks about where do we then locate them so that we ensure that there is a crossover between residential communities and these waste management practices. You probably all have heard things like waste to energy. In what they call the hierarchy of waste management, waste to energy is actually the lowest preferred option. And what they start from in the hierarchy is what they call resource recovery. So you can actually take a piece of waste product, whatever that is, and completely reuse it as a new product. Now the interesting thing about that is that's a very complex environment because it actually requires the producer of the original product to actually produce the product in a way that actually streamlines the whole recycling process. It's very complex. It's something that's not going to happen overnight, but we expect that the expression of interest will provide a great deal of interest from the private sector into what those options will be. We expect at the close of the expression of interest that we will go out to the community in further consultation with some of the options that have been put forward for further discussion. So one of the other things I wanted to talk about today is just some of the initiatives that have been going on recently in Council. One of the major projects that we're very pleased is progressing well is the Ipswich Central to Springfield Central Rail Corridor. It's a massive piece of infrastructure that we're looking at finishing and closing that loop between Brisbane City to Ipswich Central and Brisbane City to Springfield, and closing the loop between Springfield and Ipswich. Without boring everyone on bureaucratic process, there is a thing called the South East Queensland Regional Plan, of which in there are 7 large-scale rail projects. The number one priority, as everyone would know at the moment, to the Queensland Government is Cross River Rail, which pretty much has taken up all of their time and, quite frankly, budget. Sitting behind that, there are 5 other significant pieces, of which ours is one of those 5. So Ipswich's role here, and it's really important for the council, both the administrative staff and councillors, to get better at understanding the way that we need to prioritise infrastructure investment. What's going to have the greatest impact to the community, not only from an economic perspective, but from what we refer to as a triple bottom line, being environmental, social and economic. It's been agreed that this piece of public transport infrastructure is arguably the highest priority for public infrastructure over the long term. Rail infrastructure at the moment, we assess this as probably sitting within the 30-year time frame. This has been on Council's radar for the past about 8 years and hasn't been able to be progressed. As of last week, we've been able to get the Department of Transport on board. They've committed to participate, and as of July, we will be starting the first of what they refer to as 3 stages of technical planning for the delivery of this rail corridor. So that in itself is a fairly significant step in the right direction. I would argue, if I was a betting man, you're probably still talking a 15-year time frame for the physical, first train to run between those 2 sites, purely because of the scale of the project itself. One of the other projects that, and how do I turn that?
Oh, yes.
One of the other projects I'd like to talk to now, as you've probably heard a lot in media, is the Nicholas Street development in Ipswich Central. So I'm going to play a video in the background while I talk to some of the project schedule. So again, this has been on the radar for council for about 10 years. This is what would be the old mall as referred to. So this project has started, and this is what Nicholas Street will look like in the next 2 years. So current work schedule is the repairs to the foundation underneath the Commonwealth Hotel have been completed. Leasing negotiations for tenants, Nicholas Street roadway demolition and construction and footpath upgrades are currently underway. The new paving to the alleyway between Nicholas Street and the Icon Tower have already been completed. Reconstruction of the Commonwealth Hotel design is currently underway. And the schedule of works for June to August 2019, so the next few months, is there'll be a tender for the administration building. So council themselves will actually move, and it'll come up in a second where the administration building is going to be. So you remember this particular area is where the cinemas used to be. The Ipswich Library is going to be moved from where it is in South Street at the moment and will be placed in there. And the entire precinct will be an integrated entertainment and cultural precinct. Opposite the library, so this is at the river end of Nicholas Street. So there's the Ipswich City Council, so that was the library there. On the other side, on the river end, will be Council Administration Building. So Council has sold, to help fund this, all of the buildings that we own between Nicholas Street, South, Roderick Street, South Street, the current council buildings that you'd all be familiar with. We've sold them to the Department of Health, and that's going to be, this is actually an exciting opportunity for Ipswich as well, and a significant expansion in the health precinct in Ipswich. So the hospital expansion down the street. To the extent that some of the Department of Health staff are actually moving into the Hayden Centre on South Street this month, which is causing us a bit of a challenge because we need to move our staff somewhere, as the commitment that we made to the Department of Health. So the sale of those buildings not only helped fund and underwrite this project, but it also sets the scene for a very significant expansion in the health sector in Ipswich. And that will be driven not only by the Department of Health and their hospital expansion, but the allied services and private sector investment that we'll be working on driving to sit around that core hub of the hospital and health precinct. You probably saw in the media earlier this week, the Metro, I think it's next month, will have its last day of being a hotel and is going to become an aged care facility. So, and that all sits as part of the health precinct, which will continue to develop over the next few years.
I just played it again.
All right.
Yeah.
So,
getting their bearings on what they're looking at.
Construction of the civic space, library and car park upgrade will continue over the next few months. Design for the tenancy fit out, so that to actually get to design a fit out stage goes to show how far we are with certain tenancy negotiations. Roadway curbs and pedestrian footpaths installations will occur the next few months. Design to the interior and exterior retail areas commence, and the continuation of leasing negotiation for future tenants. Unfortunately, at this stage, I can't name who we are negotiating with, because those negotiations, of course, are commercial in confidence. But it is a very exciting project. It is quite the game changer to the centre of Ipswich. One of the other initiatives that sits behind, so this project from our perspective now is classed as delivery stage, so it's under construction. From the Office of Economic Development's perspective, we look at Ipswich Central, as we internally refer to it as a much larger geographic space. In my mind, Ipswich Central covers everything from the railway workshops up to the hospital and showgrounds, including USQ, would actually bring in this area of Queen's Park, out to Ipswich West, sort of that Bunnings area, and include North Ipswich Reserve, where Norman Street Bridge is proposed to go over. So for me, that's what I would, from an economic perspective, refer to as Ipswich Central. So one of the pieces of work that we're going through at the moment, leveraging off the back of this implementation is how do we actually connect Ipswich Central? Not only from a transport perspective, but also from a pedestrian movement perspective. What does the future of North Ipswich look like? What is the capabilities of the Railway Workshops precinct, which for me is an absolute jewel in Ipswich's crown? And therefore, what does the health precinct look like through to this particular now catalyst piece? And what's the connectivity between universities, showgrounds, all the way through Riverlink, all the way out to the Railway Workshops, and of course down to what could be a sporting precinct along North Ipswich Reserve. Now, the other thing that we need to do, and back to the point of ethical decision making and investment, is we can't have everything today. It would not be, unrealistic to consider that the opportunity that exists just within that precinct is literally in the billions and billions of dollars. The rail corridor is probably going to sit somewhere between $1 to $1.5 billion, and that's just for a particular piece of transport infrastructure. Sitting behind, so what we're doing at the moment is we actually have gone back about 10 years and looked at a lot of the planning work that has already been done by council, and actually bringing that into a logical, more master plan approach, which allows us to look at the timing based on population growth and a whole range of other economic and social factors as to when we need to be positioning certain projects for not only to meet investor requirements, but also state and federal government ability to invest. And that can be tricky based on certain outcomes from different elections, but it is about being ready to position the investment opportunity to either public or private sector, but also in a timed release. As an example, what could occur as a full integrated precinct in the Railway Workshops, it wouldn't make economic sense at the moment to do it today. But that potentially might sit between, and it's not to say that things can't occur, but from an overall solution, it's probably in that 5 to 10 year positioning. So what we need to have a look at as a community is what's important, and this is where consulting with the community through the reference groups is instrumental, but also how does it align to state and federal objectives. At the end of the day, a lot of this infrastructure is going to be driven by state and federal and private sector investment. One of the other things that we're looking significantly at in Ipswich at the moment is the industrial land capacity. I don't think council has done its job to the best of our ability in communicating some of the successes that we've had, even in the time that I've been here, let alone in the last, say, 2 years. We'd all know Costco, because that's been fairly well promoted, but the Rheinmetall contract, does everyone know who Rheinmetall is?
Yeah.
Yep. So,
I don't, sorry.
okay, so Rheinmetall, did you say tanks? I get in trouble all the time for calling them tanks.
Sorry, now.
Tanks are tracked vehicles, and these are armoured personnel vehicles, because if you don't have a track and it's got wheels, they're an armoured personnel. I get in trouble all the time for calling them tanks. But yes, they're the tanks. So Rheinmetall won a federal contract. The interesting thing about the defence, for those who are investors, there is only one customer in defence, and that's the federal government. So it kind of makes life easy because you're only dealing with one person. It's also big numbers. So to give you an idea, the Phase 2, a Land 400 Phase 2, which was the project that Rheinmetall was successful in winning and is currently under construction out at the Goodlands Precinct, or what they refer to as the Military Centre of Excellence facility, was about $5 billion and will produce 275 armoured personnel vehicles. In April just gone, Rheinmetall submitted another bid to the federal government for what they call Land 400 Phase 3. 4 applications went in from around the world. Rheinmetall, their submission is, if they win it, it will be in Ipswich, and that's mandated. And they're actually building the facility to address their Phase 2 contract, scoped to be able to already meet Phase 3 if they win. Which, by the way, from a bidding perspective is very advantageous because they haven't had to factor the cost of construction into this bid. 3 other bids have gone into the federal government, one from South Korea, one from Canada, and a European company, which I've forgotten the name of. And the European company has said if they win, they will establish themselves in Australia, but that'll be in Victoria. So the state government of Victoria is working very hard with them. The other two bids will have some local content, but the bulk of their work, they're saying, will be overseas. I would like to think that the federal government will show preferential treatment to those who are going to create the jobs in Australia. So for me, I'd say it's probably Rheinmetall or the Canadian or the European company. If it's Rheinmetall, to give you an idea of the scope, there's about 300, give or take, jobs that Rheinmetall will create of their own employees out there, but about another 1,500 jobs through their supply chain of businesses. And that's not an unusual model on projects of that scale. Phase 3, which is the bid that they've just put in, is $15 billion. So it's 3 times the size of this project to build tanks. These are actually tanks, the ones they'll build next.
With the track.
Yes. Yeah. And 80% of those vehicles are for export to other countries. So the sheer scale, the dollar value is great, but it's actually about the number of jobs that are created. So there's a lot of work we're doing with them now in the being optimistic about the potential of that investment to develop the supply chain capabilities of businesses. One of the challenges for that to Ipswich business is there is a very high standard of requirements for the subcontractors and the employees within those subcontractors. So there's a lot of industry development and capability building work that we're doing with Rheinmetall to support their requirements. To put that into perspective of when that would occur, in October the federal government will announce a shortlist of 2. So of the 4, that will come down to 2. And those 2 companies will be given 12 months to build 1 prototype out of their own pocket. $40 million to build a test vehicle. Of those 2, in now 18 months' time, someone will win a $15 million contract. If you are the unlucky one, you don't get your $40 million back. So it gives you an idea of just the sheer scale of what it costs to even bid for a piece of work. Rheinmetall will tell me whether they win or lose, by the time they finish the bidding, by the final decision, they've probably spent $70 million. And that's if they lose. So, but it's all relative to winning $15 billion. So it's all sort of relative. The other thing I wanted to talk about was, and we need to improve our job here, is, so you've got your Rheinmetalls, you've got your Australian Post, you've got your Costco's, and the number of jobs that they've created. And I specifically choose those types of companies because they all require industrial land. Ipswich, and quite frankly, this is one of the reasons why I took this job. Last year there was a report produced about industrial land capabilities of Queensland. To give you an idea, and this, you'll understand it from a financial planning perspective, it doesn't make sense in real life, but Brisbane, for example, will run on the current growth rate of industrial purchases, industrial land purchasing. Brisbane will run out of industrial land in 30 years. Now that's if no increase in purchasing happens. That's based on current purchasing trends. Ipswich, based on the volume on current purchasing trends, we have 600 years of industrial land. Now we won't have 600 years of industrial land because the closer we get to Brisbane running out, those purchases will go to Ipswich, will go to Logan, will go to Redwood, will go to Moore. One of the things that we need to do is, compared to my competitors, Logan and everyone else, is the road access, the access to the port, the access to an international airport. We could not be better positioned from a Queensland perspective to attract that high-end, what they call big box customer. The upside to that kind of customer is they don't employ 2 people. They employ 100 at a time, or 200 at a time, or 300 at a time. So certainly one of my commitments to Ipswich is how do we best do that, but do it in a way that the type of customer that we're bringing in ticks that triple bottom line approach of community, environment, and also economic development. So, did anyone...
You just spent a whole lot of money, Paul.
Sorry?
Billions. That's it. Thank you. That's very good. Has anybody got any questions?
Norman.
Hey, please.
Yeah, Norman Street.
Oh, sorry.
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 Yep.
You're second, Meryl.
Okay. Can you get that video that you've got on the camera or anything? Just have a look at it.
Yes, actually, I'm pretty sure it is actually, again, another thing that we haven't done well, but we're working on it. There actually is a website called nichollasstreet.com.au.
Done, yeah.
And I'm pretty, we actually haven't marketed that very
Please send that
well.
to everybody.
Let me just confirm that and make sure, and I'm pretty sure that, the website certainly
Can I
exists.
release that?
Uh,
Oh God, see, now you've made it.
So I actually, let me just check. I'm pretty sure that fly-through is already on the website. We just haven't marketed the web. It is? There you go. Thank you.
Oh, you just checked it?
No.
Alright, so if you just go to nicholasstreet.com.au, pretty much everything that I've said and lots of other information is already on that website. It's also the go-to website for what else is coming up and implications to local traders and all those types of things.
Now,
With all of these people coming into Ipswich, the extra bridge over the river, everything's coming into East Ipswich, East Street.
Absolutely. So transport infrastructure and quite frankly transport planning is probably one of the most significant challenges we're going to have based on population growth. So the Norman Street Bridge is currently at, and again I won't bore you with bureaucratic terms, but it's actually at what they call DBC, Detailed Business Case level from a state government perspective. So we expect to be utilising the timing of next year's state election to be positioning that for funding. The challenge with that is it's about a $600 million project and there's only so much money in the pool of state and federal money, and we'll be bidding against everybody else who wants a bridge. So the good news is we are at the planning stage where we are ready to build, for want of a better term. Now we need to, and this is where our incoming councillors next year will be so important, because at the end of the day, for me, that's one of their number one jobs, and that is to advocate for the key infrastructure that the community needs. So we want to be in the position come March next year, which is 6 months out from the state election, to have our key projects, and for me, there is a project in World Transformation that's called the Prioritisation and Advocacy Framework, which I actually lead. And within the next few months, what will be going public is what are the major projects for Ipswich. I can certainly tell you that in the top three will be the rail corridor and the bridge. Now, the difference between the rail corridor and the bridge, to put it in perspective, is the stuff that we're advocating for the rail corridor at the moment is actually relatively low cost because it's the planning phase. Whereas the bridge, because it's gone past planning, it's now an investment. We're asking for hundreds of millions of dollars as opposed to a few $100,000 for the planning process. So that doesn't mean that the rail corridor isn't as important, but we're just advocating for a different thing, if that makes sense. Sitting behind the Norman Street Bridge, is also what we refer to as the ring road. So council's been working on a large-scale transport plan because the bridge is incredibly important, but the bridge links to a whole stack of other network issues. Current impacts on Brisbane Street, Limestone Street, East Street, and having the bridge, what impact does that have on other road networks across the area? So we're actually looking at a much larger transport plan, which the bridge is a component of, to say, as we probably have all seen, Ipswich is talking about doubling its population in the next 20 to 25 years. So therefore we sort of need to have a 25-year transport plan, again coming back to the fact that we may need a bridge within the next 5 years, but what do we need in 7 to 10 years? What do we need in 10 to 15 years? And quite frankly, again, we're probably talking about billions of dollars worth of infrastructure, but unless that sits as part of a long-term plan that links to our growth strategy, or not just growth strategy, our growth forecasts, then it makes it far more difficult to advocate for. Because we actually go in and say, we want you to fund a bridge. Whereas what we should be saying, we've got 25 years worth of requirements that we've already forecast and planned for. We need this now because it's a critical piece to our overarching transport plan.
Any other questions?
Can I just expand a bit in the transport? For example, Glebe Road, down the Baval end. If you're driving along there, many a time I come across and you've got a car parked on one side, a car parked on the other, and there's you and a bus trying to come through. It ain't gonna work because council has taken away the fact you park two wheels on the footpath, that gave the space, so you've got full cars there.
I'll get you to talk to Paul at Morning Tea, Stuart.
Apart from the rail corridor, you haven't mentioned much about Springfield. Residential development is certainly going ahead in leaps and bounds down there, but everything else seems to have stalled. Arveo seems to have stalled. There are rumours around the health sector down there. Is anything happening down there?
Oh, there's lots happening with Springfield. So, the statement about the rail corridor is not area specific. It's a link across the entire region, but specific to Springfield. So we work closely with those, and you're right. They have a pretty high focus, and we're working with them on it around their health precinct. For them, health precinct is not only the expansion of certain services within their health, especially in maternity, that they want to bring into their particular hospital. But Springfield have got a very high strategic focus on R&D, so technology-based companies setting up out there. Two of the key areas that they are focused on is in the education sector, but also in the health sector. And another area that we actually work quite closely with them on is, I don't like using the term innovation because it's such a broad reference, but areas around clean energy and green tech. They have a high investment strategy in increasing the number of EV power stations, electric power stations, around Springfield. So I do understand what you mean by it seems to have gone quiet, but certainly from the back end planning and negotiating and investment attraction component, they're working very hard, and they have a very much sort of technology driven investment strategy.
One more question, then we'll break. So, Steve, Ian, we'll catch up with you at morning tea. Steve?
There's been a forecast increase or upgrade for the Cunningham Highway between Manso and Airport. Is that road? It's essentially narrow for trucks, defence members going to work and things like that.
So again, the specific to the answer to that question, I would have to defer to my transport people, but the broad answer is yes. I would have to know exactly the area you're referring to. So there was a commitment made by the feds, I want to say a year or two ago, for a percentage of the amount that would be required to upgrade that particular stretch. And there are conversations happening between state and federal as to who's prepared to put more in to help actually deliver the overall project. That is one of the challenges in large-scale infrastructure. It's, someone will...
That's atrocious out there, isn't
it? And it's certainly, so pre the federal election, which quite frankly, I don't think anyone saw the real outcome of that, we had been lobbying pretty heavily with our local Labor member and he actually had made some election commitments in that space. The challenge now is that we don't stop our advocacy, but that it's not going to come from that current area because they didn't win the election.
Okay, we might wrap up, if that's all right. Will you join us for morning tea?
Love to.
Oh, thanks, Paul. That's great. So if you could make your way in an orderly fashion